On March 30th, 1979, the NHL finally made peace with the WHA by agreeing to take in 4 WHA franchises via a merger that was negotiated between the two leagues. The deal saw the NHL absorb the Edmonton Oilers, Hartford Whalers, Winnipeg Jets, and Quebec Nordiques, while the WHA and its remaining franchises ceased operations. However, the merger was not as clean as it was for other major North American sports leagues like the NBA and the NFL, and to some older hockey fans, the actions of the NHL in 1979 have not been forgotten. Hello everyone, my name is King Gratz, and welcome to part 2 of the story of the NHL's merger with the WHA. This is a direct continuation of part 1, so if you have not watched part 1 yet, please go and check out that video. You can check out my channel page for that. Part 2 will focus more on the aftermath of the NHL's merger with the WHA, and in particular what happened in the 1979 NHL offseason to the 4 incoming WHA franchises into the NHL. If I do miss anything in this video, I apologize, and I appreciate anybody who does come in the comments section and actually explain any details that I may have missed. Thank you. Probably going to be a long video just like part 1, so I appreciate it if you can just sit back, relax, and just listen to me for the next little while. If you want to skip to a certain part of the video, feel free to use the timestamps which are in the description below, and let's dive into it. So to recap the ending of part 1, the NHL officially agreed to merge with the WHA and bring in the 4 WHA franchises that I just mentioned, while the remaining franchises basically would fold outright, along with the WHA ceasing operations. The story of this merger, however, at least when it comes to an NHL standpoint, is that it's not recognized formally as a merger, and rather the NHL sees this as more of like a traditional league expansion, in which the Oilers, Jets, Whalers, and Nordiques were all recognized as traditional expansion teams that were completely brand new rather than continuations of the WHA's teams as a whole. And as a result, the NHL undergoes this very complicated process of how these 4 teams were treated in a way that was very much biased in favor of the NHL and very much is a byproduct of the NHL's distaste for the WHA and the legacy that the league had created on hockey in its entirety. The main point of this video is to really kind of explain how the 4 WHA franchises were essentially kind of dismantled at the very beginning and were sort of in like a sink or swim situation for their inaugural years in the NHL's history books, and explaining sort of how the NHL undertook the task of breaking down each of these franchises piece by piece. It was a very meticulous effort, and the amount of information regarding this is quite extensive here. So there's 3 major things that I'll be talking about. There is a dispersal draft, there is a reclamation draft, and there is the expansion drafts that happened at the end. And this is all done in the summer of 1979, leading up to the 1979-1980 NHL season. It should be noted that the WHA did extract 3 key concessions from the NHL in the merger talks, and these 3 concessions were as follows. So number 1, the NHL agreed to take in all of the Canadian franchises from the WHA. Number 2, the NHL would agree to not entirely dismantle the WHA franchises upon their entry into the NHL, and that did lead to some player protections taking place, which I will get to later in this video. And number 3, the NHL would freeze the expansion costs for each of the 4 WHA teams at $6 million US. However, this number does balloon to $7.5 million as a result of compensation that had to be given to the WHA franchises that did not make it to the NHL. I'll explain that more later in this video, but those are the 3 major concessions that we have to understand here. Now let's look at the 3 major points. So starting off with the dispersal draft. The WHA, following its final season concluding in 1979, the league would establish a dispersal draft for the franchises that were not going to enter the NHL as part of the merger, so those being the Birmingham Bulls and the Cincinnati Stingers. The players of these 2 franchises would be divided into 2 separate groups, in which players that were 20 years old or younger would immediately qualify for the NHL's rookie draft in 1979, while everybody else would become eligible for the dispersal draft, where the remaining WHA teams that were going to join the NHL had the ability to pick up any of the players from the Bulls and Stingers franchises. This also includes the Indianapolis Racers, who folded a year prior in 1977-78, but they had more of a minor role to play in this dispersal draft since the team had already folded and ceased operations altogether. In addition, as part of the rules for this dispersal draft, the 4 incoming WHA teams had agreed that for the 1979 entry draft, they would all pick at the bottom of each round, which is in stark contrast to what we see today with existing teams that come into the NHL, where every one of them either gets the number 1 pick or at bare minimum probably gets in like the top 5, top 10. So this is very much different to what we get nowadays. When you look at the Birmingham Bulls and the Cincinnati Stingers rosters, most of the talented players actually were eligible for the NHL Rookie Draft. So in total, 7 Bulls players and 2 Stingers players would enter the 1979 draft. I'm not going to say these guys in a particular draft order, I'm just listing them out here. So we have Rob Ramage, Rick Vive, Craig Hartsburg, Michel Goulet, Gaston Gingras, Pat Riggin, Keith Crowder, Mike Gartner, and Mark Messier. The full list of players for the dispersal draft will be included in the description. Just look for the link to the main article that you can find online. Most of the players that were involved in the dispersal draft had very insignificant NHL careers. Most of these guys are career minor leaguers. There was 1 or 2 major exceptions really to this. Mike Liu was drafted by the Edmonton Oilers in the dispersal draft, coming from the Cincinnati Stingers. He was a veteran NHL goalie for his career. And we also have Paul Henderson, who was drafted by the Hartford Whalers from the Birmingham Bulls. So next up we have what was called the Reclamation Draft. So to simplify things here, in the Reclamation Draft, the existing NHL franchises had the ability to reclaim any players that they had lost to the WHA that were on the 4 incoming franchises. The 4 incoming franchises really didn't have much of a choice as to who they could protect here. The NHL did allow for the 4 incoming teams to, at best, protect 2 skaters and 2 goaltenders. That's it. Everybody else had to be available for this Reclamation Draft. And now for the players that would be protected, they were considered to be priority selections, in which that their NHL rights would be voided, and as a result, they would become the exclusive property of the WHA team. As we also see in current iterations of NHL expansion, the incoming franchises also had the ability to negotiate trades with the existing NHL teams, mostly to get concessions for having control over certain players in preparation for the Reclamation Draft, and some of these trades were pretty lopsided in hindsight. The biggest example that I can provide here was the Quebec Nordiques trading a first-round draft pick to the Chicago Blackhawks, so that way the Blackhawks would not reclaim Réal Cloutier in the Reclamation Draft, which the Hawks had his rights. That pick was unprotected, and the Nordiques unfortunately were not good coming out of the gate for the NHL, and that first round pick turned into Dennis Savard in the NHL draft. There were probably other trades that happened as well, but this is probably the most notable one I can provide to you right now. Now, of the players that were reclaimed, there weren't too many notable guys on this list, at least with regards to common casual NHL knowledge, but there are some big names that you could probably recall based on history. So we have the biggest names available: Bobby Hall, Kent Nielsen, Dave Semenko, and Mike Liu. Mike Liu, who I just mentioned, by the way, was picked up in the dispersal draft. He would also get reclaimed in the Reclamation Draft. So how ironic. Of course, the full list for this will also be included in the description, so feel free to check that out if you wish. Now, in addition, in preparation for this Reclamation Draft, there was also 3 major exceptions that were made for specific players that were on the WHA teams. So number 1, we have Wayne Gretzky. Wayne Gretzky's story is kind of already well known, depending on how old you are or how much you know of hockey history, but Wayne Gretzky's professional playing career started in the WHA with him signing a personal services contract with the Indianapolis Racers owner, Nelson Scalbania. Now, Scalbania at the time recognized Gretzky as a superstar level talent as a teenager, and there was hope that he could essentially hold on to Gretzky's contract even if the Racers had to fold outright, and potentially he could sell Gretzky's contract to a highest bidder, when the WHA essentially folded. And perhaps there was also a chance that Scalabania was hoping that he could get concessions from the NHL for having Gretzky's contract, but at the end of the day, this didn't really do much for him or the Racers franchise whatsoever. The story basically goes that after the Indianapolis Racers folded, Gretzky's contract would be sold to Peter Pocklington, who was the owner of the WHA's Edmonton Oilers, and Pocklington would hold on to Gretzky's contract going into the merger in 1979 with the NHL. Pocklington was hoping that Gretzky would hang on to his contract and respect the rights of this contract, which was technically a violation for the NHL's rules because the NHL stated at the time every player had to be signed to a standard playing contract, whereas in the WHA there were no restrictions on player contracts whatsoever. So as a result, Gretzky technically should have gone to the NHL's entry draft because of his age, but because of his contract, he technically could avoid that altogether. Gretzky really had a choice here. He could rip up his contract, for one, in which he would join the NHL's entry draft and most likely would have been the consensus #1 pick going to the Colorado Rockies that year, or number two, he could respect his contract with the Oilers and stay with Edmonton going into the inaugural season for the team in the NHL. Gretzky decided to stay with the Oilers, so as a result, Gretzky technically was classified as a priority selection by the NHL for the Edmonton, and as a result, his contract would become exclusive property for the Oilers, and he was protected from any sort of action by the NHL teams and the NHL draft. The other two exceptions involve two other players. Number one, we have Gordie Howe, who at this time was already into his 50s and was with the Hartford Whalers. There was a gentleman's agreement between the Whalers and the Detroit Red Wings in which the Red Wings agreed to not reclaim Gordie Howe in the Reclamation Draft, so that way he can stay in Hartford. The third and final case was Dave Keon. Dave Keon was a part of the Hartford Whalers at the time. The owner of the Toronto Maple Leafs, Harold Ballard, was hoping to reclaim Dave Keon in the Reclamation Draft, but NHL President John Ziegler had to convince Ballard to allow Keon to stay with Hartford, and as a result, the Whalers were able to retain Dave Keon following the Reclamation Draft. So now let's look at the expansion draft itself and also the associated fees. So as I mentioned, the four WHA franchises had to pay $6 million as an expansion fee to the NHL, but this number balloons to $7.5 million because each of the four teams also had to pay $1.5 million to the Birmingham Bulls and Cincinnati Stingers as compensation for those two franchises not joining the NHL within the merger. On top of this, from the four expansion teams, that $6 million from each of them would then be shared among the existing NHL franchises in a way that was also kind of interesting. As part of the expansion draft for each of the four teams, for every player of the existing NHL franchises that was lost in the expansion draft, the team would be compensated with $125,000 from the expansion fee from the four franchises. Now, for the expansion draft, each of the 17 existing NHL franchises had major protections available for their rosters. In total, the teams were allowed to protect 15 skaters and 2 veteran goalies. And this resulted in a very limited talent pool that was available for the WHA teams to enter the NHL with a good amount of talent to at least survive their inaugural season. And as a result, the players that actually were available and were picked up in the expansion draft, a lot of them were not very notable NHLers, and some of them even had already been involved in the reclamation and the dispersal drafts that came prior. Some examples that I'll provide you with here, Bobby Hall was reclaimed by Chicago in the reclamation draft, and then he was redrafted by the Winnipeg Jets in their expansion draft. Probably the biggest example I could provide for you right then and there. The full list, once again, can be found in the description, but to essentially summarize it, most of the players that were picked up by the Oilers, Jets, Nordiques, and Whalers were not as effective as what the players they had before when they were in the WHA. And as a result, the success of these four incoming teams for the NHL's 1979-1980 season was very much mixed. When you look at the official record books for the 1979-80 season, the Whalers were actually the most successful of the four incoming teams, having made the playoffs, while the Oilers barely squeaked into the playoffs as the last team to make it in, and the Nordiques and Jets completely fell apart, and they finished as two of the worst teams in the NHL for that season, and this would commence sort of a hefty rebuild for each of those two franchises. The long-term trajectories of each of the four WHA teams was very different. The Oilers were the most successful as they were able to recover, and by the mid-1980s, they successfully developed a NHL powerhouse and a championship dynasty with Wayne Gretzky and other NHL legends like Mark Messier and co. The Whalers, Nordiques, and the Jets would all eventually suffer from either financial constraints or arena issues, and as a result, each of these three franchises have relocated up to this point in time. The Nordiques were the first to go in 1995, relocating to Colorado to become the Colorado Avalanche. You have the Winnipeg Jets relocating in 1996 to Arizona to become the Phoenix Coyotes. Since then, they have now relocated to Utah and have become the Utah Mammoth. And the Hartford Whalers will relocate in 1997 to Raleigh, North Carolina, where they have now become the Carolina Hurricanes. For each of those franchises that relocated, most of them have seen success. The Avalanche, since relocating, won 3 Stanley Cups, winning in 1996, 2001, and as most recently in 2022. The Whalers, after relocating to Carolina, the Hurricanes would win the Stanley Cup in 2006, and at least since 2019, they have been a perennial Cup contender in the NHL. The Jets, after relocating to Arizona, did not find much success in Phoenix, as the Coyotes were a mediocre laughingstock for most of their history, with a lot of incompetent ownership and management. And recently, having relocated to Utah, there is genuine hope that this franchise could actually get off the ground in a new and fresh market. That's basically the story of the NHL's merger with the WHA and what happened to those 4 franchises upon entry into the NHL. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate all of your support. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content like this one, and I'll see you all in my next video.